the history of Tweed salmon and its lessons for today. The purpose of this presentation is to show how essential it is to understand the past history of Tweed salmon in order to understand the present. And there are a lot of changes going on in Tweed salmon runs at the moment, as everyone who fishes and works with the river will know. Autumn runs have declined in both salmon and grouse, summer salmon catches have increased, spring has stayed much the same. And these similar changes are happening on other rivers at this time as well. And so the first question that always needs to be asked about any changes: has this happened before, or is it something new? And this is why understanding history is so important. That's just an illustration of the sort of changes that are going on. You'll notice that in both July and November, although there are general trends, year-to-year variation can be considerable, especially in November, where you can see the trend in catches is very strongly downwards. But in 2010 and 2013 there were huge runs of grouse that went completely against this trend. Now, it's not just the numbers of fish that are changing, but their sizes. So this shows it's not just some factor like netting coming off that's at play. These changes in sizes show that the nature of the fish themselves are changing. So in July and August the fish have been getting bigger. October and November the fish have been getting smaller. And that's because the types of fish in the river are changing. Back in the late 90s, a fish of 7 to 10 pounds, these were mainly grouse. But at present, fish of 7 to 10 pounds are mainly salmon. And you can see at the side there how the commonest sizes of grouse have been dropping almost by a pound every 5 years. Commonest salmon sizes have been changing too. That's because instead of large late autumn salmon, we have been getting more of the earlier and smaller summer salmon. And we can trace these sorts of changes back into the 18th century, looking at the proportions of grouse and salmon. So you can see back in the late 18th century we had more salmon than grouse. Then beginning of the 19th century it switches to be more grouse than salmon. Then at the end of the 19th century we get a period when they're pretty much 1-to-1, 1 grouse per 1 salmon. Then we shift into a period when there were more salmon than grouse, and then around about the 1960s we shift into the recent period when there were more grouse than salmon. But do note that towards the end of this data series we are beginning to lose the netting in the spring, and that rather affects the proportions of grouse and salmon. Still basically the same, but grouse are probably overemphasized. We can see these effects, these changeovers, in the catches of the Tweed netting stations. So obviously red is the grouse catches, salmon is the blue catches, and you can see that it was in 1906 that salmon became more numerous than grouse in the rod catches, and that went on till actually 1959, when grouse again became commoner than salmon. And at the beginning of that series you'll notice that huge drop in grouse numbers in the 1850s. That was a very dramatic decrease and much observed at the time. Now the shortage of grouse at the end of the 19th century was again very obvious, as we have a comment here by Cauderwood in 1909. People were very concerned, not just in the Tweed but all over Scotland, about what was happening to the grouse at the end of the 19th century. There were suggestions even that grouse might be becoming extinct. Not just the Tweed being affected by these changes. We've got data from the Spey, the Don, the Dee as well as the Tweed, and you can see that that gross high at the beginning of the 19th century was shared by all the rivers, and the gross low in the 1920s was also shared by all the rivers. This sort of thing is happening again. This is data from the Environment Agency, and it's for all the rod fisheries of England and Wales combined. And you can see that just in recent years, salmon have become more common in the catches than grouse. So we've got history repeating itself. So what are the likely future trends? Well, based on what we've seen in the past, I think the likely things to happen are that most grouse will come in summer rather than autumn, and they'll be small. Salmon will outnumber grouse. The switch could be to spring or to summer salmon. It's not clear yet. And of course, as salmon have a lower survival rate at sea than grouse, numbers will not be as high as in the recent grouse period. This is basically because salmon spend 2 winters at sea, 2 years at sea. Grouse spend only 1. So a salmon has twice the chance of meeting with an accident than grouse do. So why are grouse going to come back earlier? Well, this is based on previous results showing the proportion of the total grouse run that comes in each month. Green is July, and you can see the 1920s, 1960s, when we had high spring salmon, low numbers of grouse, most grouse returned in July. Whereas on either side of that period, you can see most grouse actually returned in August, which is purple, and September, which is blue. So that seems to be the common thing. When grouse get fewer in numbers, they're coming back earlier. And again, from the Environment Agency, we get data showing that this history is repeating itself again. This is from the River Tamar in Devon, from the fish counter there. And you can see around about 2004, 2005, only about 10% of grouse were back by the 1st of August. Now it's 50 to 60% are back by the 1st of August. And again, going on the past, when grouse numbers fall, as they did in the 1850s and the 1920s, they get smaller. And this is an example from the 1850s, from the rake nets and the Dee, and it's the catches in the last month of the season, 14th August, 14th September. And you can see in those 5 years, not only the number of grouse caught fell dramatically, but their size also fell fairly dramatic in just that 5-year period. And again, in another grouse depression, the 1920s and 30s, average was down to about £4. But as numbers improved towards the 50s and the 60s, the average size of grouse started to increase. So those are two things, another two things that go together. When grouse get fewer, they also get smaller. And again, we have data from the Environment Agency showing that history is repeating itself. You can see around about 2004, 2005, the average size of grouse in the River Tamar fish trap was just under £7. Now it's about £4.50. Most of the work on salmon cycles and changes was done by Tony George back in the 1980s. And he makes a number of interesting observations. The first of them is that the history of the Scottish salmon fishery over a long period of time shows that whenever a salmon period declines and the grouse period comes in, there are for a period of years strong joint runs of both salmon and grouse in many large rivers. And to have strong joint runs is pretty unusual. It's a sign of a transition period. Normally you either have a lot of salmon or a lot of grouse. You don't have big numbers of both. So that period, those periods are really quite exceptional. And you should be careful when you see a series of data, a series of catch data, for example, beginning around about 1955-60, because that was not a normal period. It's not a period that's suitable to be a baseline. But when a grouse period declines and a salmon period comes in, there's always a significant, albeit variable, gap in years before the salmon becomes established. And that, I think, is the sort of period we are going into. We're switching from a grouse period into a salmon period, and what Tony George had to say about that was that during such periods the fishery as a whole is at a low ebb. So what are the causes behind all this? Well, the main suggestion is it's warmer conditions in the subarctic where the salmon and grouse feed. And there's a suggestion that fish travel further north when the minimum temperature stays above 2 degrees. So effectively the fish stay longer at sea, therefore they come back as salmon rather than grouse. And Tony George predicted that warming conditions seen then start to impoverish the grouse food chain, so they decline in numbers, size and condition. And grouse feed the first year at sea is in the northeast Atlantic. The northwest Atlantic is where fish go for their second winter at sea when there's salmon. There is actually an opposite view from Norway, that it's warm winters are actually better for grouse and increase their proportion in Norwegian rivers. Why that opposite conclusion was reached, I am not sure. And this takes us to what's called the NAO, the North Atlantic Oscillation. And this is the great governing factor of weather in this part of the world. When you've got a strong pressure difference, what's called a strong NAO, a positive NAO, you've got a big difference in atmospheric pressure between the low pressure area at Iceland and the high pressure area around the Azores. And in that situation you've got lots of strong westerly winds, and the northeast Atlantic, where the grouse feed, becomes warm and wet. The opposite is when there isn't so much of a pressure difference between Iceland and the Azores. You don't have such westerly winds, and the northeast Atlantic area becomes more continental in its climate and colder and drier. That's called the negative NAO. Now these can vary dramatically from year to year, the pressures, but they do tend to group into longer periods. And this is called the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, the AMO. And what's shown in this graph are periods when sea surface temperatures are warmer than average, and periods when they are colder than average. Now of course such a huge climatic factor doesn't just affect the sea and the fish, it affects everything on land and sea. And so the AMO can be reconstructed from 3 growth rings. And you can see, if we put the fish data on, that in the 18th century it was generally a positive NAO of warmer winters, and that's when we had more salmon and grouse. Then we went into a very strong negative NAO when sea temperatures were lower than normal, and that fits with the grouse period of the beginning of the 19th century. Then we get into a sort of 1-to-1 period, which we'll look at in more detail later. Then we get into a definite positive NAO, AMO, and we get more salmon than grouse. Then we went into the negative, which is our recent grouse period, and we're heading back into a positive zone and more salmon than grouse. Now we can look at recent years in more detail with direct measurements of sea surface temperature starting in the 1880s. And if we put the fish data onto that, you can see that that 1-to-1 period corresponds to a time when there wasn't really a stable situation. You had warm winter years and cold winter years almost alternating, and that could explain why we get this 1-to-1 ratio. There was no driver in the environment pushing them to either grouse or salmon. But then we get into the 1910-1960 period when we've got warmer sea surface temperatures, and that matches with the salmon period. Then from about 1970 onwards we go into a negative AMO, colder winters. That matches the recent grouse period. And then, unfortunately, without netting data, we come into the present and we're back into a positive AMO, and that suggests that, as we are seeing, we will get more salmon than grouse. Possibly that started around 1910. But as I said before, you get these huge annual fluctuations. If we go back to the November catches, we had those two huge grouse runs, 2010, 2013, and they could well match, as you see, those sudden cold periods in amongst the generally warmer period. Now, as I said before, the AMO is a massive climate factor. It affects everything, not just the sea. And this is data showing how the NAO, the colder winters for the negative NAO and the warmer winters for the positive, how it affects the time at which fry emerge. So when we've got colder winters of the negative NAO, we get half the fry only emerging by early May. But when we've got positive NAO and warmer winters, half the fry have emerged by late March. And this, of course, relates to stream temperatures. When a negative NAO, we've got colder winters and colder streams. Positive NAO, we've got warmer winters and warmer streams. And so we get the difference in hatches. Now, as the Elliots point out, if fry emergence becomes consistently earlier as a result of warmer winters, then the length of the growth period in the first year of the life cycle could be extended. This could affect subsequent life stages, especially the timing of smoltification. So it's possible that those big swings between grouse and salmon are not entirely due to marine factors. They may also be due to some freshwater factors as well. Now, to go back to history on the Tweed, these huge changes were of course noticed by people at the time, and it's interesting to see how they were reported. This is from the Scotsman in 1920, and it says the headline is "Now a Spring River, an exceptionally good spring season followed by another deplorable autumn is what one has to record of Tweed salmon angling in 1920. 1921, the report is of the best spring and the worst autumn fishing on record. But they do make an interesting point that although there had been spring fishing from the 1st of February since the new season started in 1959, spring fishing did not become a feature of the Tweed till around 1911. And that's about 20 or so years after the decline of the grouse was causing real concern. And that fits with Tony George's predictions that when you're moving from a grouse to a salmon period, it takes a number of years for salmon to really establish themselves. And the article goes on to ask a very interesting question. In the 1920s, spring salmon was something rather new and strange in the Tweed, and people did wonder what they were and why they had appeared in such numbers. As the article says, who can say why the lively little fish appear in the river so early in the year, and who can tell what they are? Are they delayed growth? If not, the disappearance of grouse is another of the puzzling problems connected with the salmon. And there certainly is some sort of link between grouse and spring salmon. If you have a lot of one, you don't have many of the other. Now, is that just the same fish responding to different conditions out at sea and so changing the time at which they return? Or are we talking about distinct genetic components that expand and contract in response to environmental conditions. And certainly the evidence is that the timing of maturity of whether fish come back after 1 year or 2 years is under genetic control. If that's the case, then that would suggest that the rise and fall of gills and salmon is the rise and fall of different genetic components, possibly meaning even that they expand and contract their spawning areas within the catchment. Now, things like the AMO must have been going on since the Ice Age, but we of course don't have fishing data going back more than a couple of 100 years, except for this one little window in 1618, where we've got a report by a Londoner called John Taylor, who called himself the King's Waterport, who visited Berwick in that year. And he reported that in the River of Tweed, which runs by Berwick, are taken by fishermen that dwell there infinite numbers of fresh salmons. There was an order that no man or boy whatsoever should fish upon a Sunday. But some 8 or 9 weeks before Michaelmas last, on a Sunday, the salmons played in such great abundance in the river that some of the fishermen, contrary to God's law and their own order, took boats and nets and fished, and caught near 300 salmons. But from that time until Michaelmas Day that I was there, which was 9 weeks, and heard report of it, and saw the poor people's miserable lamentations, they had not seen one salmon in the river. And some of them were in despair that they should never see any more there, affirming it to be God's judgment upon them for the profanation of the Sabbath. But if you look at the tree-ring reconstruction of the AMO, you can see that in that period round about the beginning of the 17th century, things were beginning to switch towards a positive AMO, and that's the sort of time when you could expect perhaps the girls' run to fail in some years, as it did obviously in 1618. So to sum up, history or background is important. We spend our time day-to-day salmon management. We've always got to keep in mind that these large-scale changes do happen, and it's not a question of if they happen, but when they happen, and those must change all our assumptions and all our stock parameters. And in particular, we need to be able to identify when such changes are happening, and so not waste time and resources trying to counteract them by, for instance, trying to restore spring salmon or autumn gills when the environment has clearly changed against them. To sum up, you cannot reverse the North Atlantic oscillation. And just to give an example, a final example of this sort of thing, in the 1970s there was great concern over the decline of the spring salmon. People thought it might even mean the extinction of salmon altogether. And you can see why they were concerned. Here's the catches of spring salmon on a Middle Tweed fishery, starting in 1952. And you can see it's a pretty catastrophic decline. Now the reason I started that graph in 1952 is that is when national catch recording started in Scotland. And just about every piece of analysis of catch data therefore begins in 1952. But of course 1952 was not the beginning of the world, and if we look further back at that same fishery, you can get a completely different picture. Before the decline of the spring salmon, there was the rise of the spring salmon, and that makes a great difference in understanding what was going on. It looks much more like a cycle than just a decline. And I think this is a good illustration of how if you change the baseline, if you get a big picture instead of a small picture, it can completely change your understanding of what is happening in the present. And that shows, I think, the importance of history, of knowing the background, if you're going to understand correctly what is happening in the present. And just a reminder that the 1960s was a wholly exceptional period when there were both large runs of salmon and grouse, and not a period to be taken as a baseline for a series of catch data.